Hi, this is James Valvis, and I'm going to be doing a Poepinion today. I'm going to let the genius Edgar Allan Poe take over my body and speak to you about literary matters, large and small. In this case, I'll be doing a review of the book Boys and Girls Together by William Saroyan. Now, for those of you who don't know, William Saroyan is one of my favorite writers. He's such a favorite writer that I'm almost a completist. I've read just about everything he's ever written. I think that there's one or two books that I have not yet gotten to, and probably some small number of uncollected or minorly collected writings. But for the most part, I've read just about everything I can get my hands on, and I've been reading him since I was in my early teens, I think, when I first came across him, and then more seriously when I was in the Army. So when I was in my early 20s, I began to read him quite seriously and study him quite seriously. And he was a influence on many of my favorite writers, either directly or indirectly. It's hard to imagine a Charles Bukowski or a Gerald Lachlan or Raymond Carver without William Saroyan. It's almost impossible to conceive of an Irwin Shaw without William Saroyan. Jack Kerouac is a direct descendant of William Saroyan. And of course, my own writing has and owes a great deal to his writing. He is one of the preeminent authors of the 20th century. He should be at least on par with Ernest Hemingway. That's how important a writer he is, especially in the short story. Not as much in the novel, and I'll get to why that is later, but definitely one of the most important writers of the early 20th century, and he continued into his later years, into the 60s, 70s, and 80s with writing autobiographical stuff that was, I think, less effective than his earlier work, but is nevertheless still pretty powerful stuff and pretty interesting stuff. It just isn't what he made his reputation on. And it was a great reputation at that. There was a time when William Saroyan could probably justifiably call himself the most famous writer in the world. They coined a term to describe his style of writing, and it's just a style of living, which was Saroyan-esque. There's no Hemingway-esque, and there's no Faulkner-esque. Those are made-up words, but everybody knows what Saroyan-esque is, or at least they did at one time. He's fallen way out of favor from that high point, and he's been falling out of favor really since probably the 50s, the 1950s, and he has been falling out of fashion for a number of reasons, partially because his best work isn't really very morose. It doesn't have the cynicism that academics came to treasure in works like from Sartre or from even from Hemingway, of Faulkner. There's no Rose for Emily. There's no The Sun Also Rises. There's nothing there that is tragic in Saroyan, especially in his most important works. You have later in his works, a depression sets in with Saroyan as his star wanes, and his early promise and success. He was astronomically successful early in life, but he began to wane, and he got bitter about it, and sometimes that bitterness came just directly out. One of my favorite essays by him is about how bitter he is about all the young people getting all the attention and him getting none of it. He said he was an entity before they were even thinking about being an entity, and it's kind of funny. It's a funny essay, but it does speak to the degree of the bitterness that he felt toward his decline in popularity. Saroyan his work is almost an extension of his personality. There isn't a whole lot of fiction in Saroyan. There wasn't even at the beginning when he was writing primarily fiction. Later on, and I'll get to this a little bit when I talk about the book, later on he all but gives up on fiction and turns just to straight autobiography. But in the beginning, even when he was doing his autobiography, even when he was doing his fiction, his earliest fiction, it all seems to stem from the great Saroyan personality, which is larger than life. It's very, to quote a term, Saroyan-esque. It's huge, and it's bubbling up, and it's overly optimistic and and just abundantly energetic. And there isn't a whole lot of time for sitting around navel gazing in a morose, Sylvia Plath or Anne Sexton kind of way. There's no darkness in the early Saroyan. There's just powerful, optimism. And you think of a play like The Time of Your Life, which is one of the great plays in all of American theater. It won the Book Critics Award. It won the Pulitzer, which he turned down because he said, he gave numerous reasons why he turned it down, but one of the reasons he said is that all his art is, equally worthy or something of that nature, or that commerce should not patronize the arts because it somehow pollutes it or something like that. I think he was just riding so high in the world that he just decided, I don't need the Pulitzer Prize. I'm bigger than the Pulitzer Prize, which is an amazing position to take. It could be why he never won a Nobel Prize, even though he was deserving of it. So that is the background of his writing. And so he starts out in the Depression writing stories for the magazine Story. And he would send them stories and they wouldn't take anything. And he said, I'm going to send you 30 stories in 30 days. For 1 month, I'm going to write you a story every day and mail it to you. So that's what he did. He wrote a story, he mailed it. He wrote a story, he mailed it. He wrote a story, he mailed it. Now, I forget how many of the stories that Story took, but they took several. He was, and the stories are absolutely brilliant. And the first story that he sent and they took was a story called The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze. It's a very famous story. It's probably his most famous story, even to this day. I don't necessarily think it's his best story, but it is his most famous. And it comes out of that groundswell where he would just type stories and they would just be marvelous, and he would just do it over and over again. He had that gift. And from there, his star just shot up through the sky because he was capable of writing incredible amounts of material of a great quality in a very short period of time. I think The Time of Your Life, the play that won the Pulitzer, he wrote like over a weekend. It was something short, very short like that. He just sequestered himself for a couple of days and banged it out, and there it was, fully formed. And you're talking about, like I said, one of the great plays in all of American theater. And it is a great play. If you ever get a chance to watch the James Cagney film that was made out of it, you'll just enjoy the heck out of it. If you get a chance to see it on Broadway or off Broadway, as I did, it's just a wonderful play, and it's just filled with great characters and great pathos, and it's just awesome. I just love it to death. And so he went on to write another book, My Name is a Ram. And to me, this is the summit of Saroyan's work. It's a book of short stories that absolutely is just, every story in it is wonderful. Every single story in it is just as good as it gets as far as short fiction goes. And from there, he went on to write many good books. many good fiction books, a lot of short stories. He continued to write short stories and sell them in the Saturday Evening Post and the Atlantic Monthly and the New Yorker, even places like that. He was selling stories in Playboy and making, and he was doing well. And then the Army got a hold of him. They drafted him into World War II. And now Saroyan was always bitter about this. He did not want to be a soldier. He did not like being in the Army. He got some material out of it. I think he wrote a book about it. But for the most part, it really stopped his flow of writing. He went into the Army. He was bitter about it. He didn't like it. And that optimism that had informed his early work changed. And after the Army, his fiction really trickled off. It was not the same. It was mostly... it was darker, it was less positive, and it was less fluid, and it was less abundant. And in addition to the Army, he got married to his wife, his only wife, Carol Saroyan, who eventually married Walter Matthau, the great actor. And after they divorced, he actually married Carol twice. He married her, he divorced her, he married her again, and divorced like the same year. They were actually they separated. I think they got married in April, and they separated and filed for divorce in October. So the second marriage didn't last long at all. She was not happy with him. He had a temper. He had a drinking problem. He had a gambling problem, and he had other issues, but she was something of a pill herself, and very young, and a bad match for William Saroyan. William Saroyan, like a lot of writers who become famous, he came out of poverty. He came out of a poor immigrant Armenian family, and he often said he only got into writing so that he could marry and have children. Just wanted to have an occupation in the world. He didn't want to, he wasn't about becoming a celebrity. It wasn't, and moving within these circles, these famous circles, was not a big deal to him. He didn't want to do that. It wasn't something that he treasured or liked. But for her, the glamour of that lifestyle is what attracted her to him. And so you're already at loggerheads. You have a problem there because she's attracted by the bright lights of Hollywood, and he's put off by it. He wants to be retiring and live simply and do his writing, and she wants to go out with her famous friends that she's making, these actors and these producers and these important people in Hollywood that she's meeting through him. And so a bad match. They had 2 children. They had a daughter. I believe her name was Strawberry Saroyan, and it's a very interesting name. And then they had Aram Saroyan, who became a writer himself. And while he was never the success, either critically or commercially, that his father was, he got fairly famous. Part of the reason he got famous is because he won an NEA grant on the virtue of a one-word poem, which is kind of a misspelling of the word light, and people were ticked off about him winning the NEA for this ridiculous poem, and with good reason. It's not worthy. It was not worthy of an NEA grant, but he would write some beatnik stuff, The Sun, and eventually would write a very scathing biography, I guess autobiography, because he included himself in it, of his father. I read that thing, and I thought it was really, really a very embittered biography. Not at all something I think would be. It wasn't a fair hearing of Saroyan's life. I think that Saroyan was a troubled man in some ways, but also a good man in a lot of ways, and an incredible artist, an absolute incredible artist. So anyway, he got out of the Army, and he went and had trouble writing. He was not the same writer he was before, and he was gambling a lot and drinking some, and it was, and he was not the money, and she was spending a lot of his money and not wanting to live simply. And so he was, blowing through their savings when most of his money was coming in from the stuff he had written before he went in the army. And that's where we find this novel. Now, this novel really marks the last time that William Saroyan writes fiction. Boys and Girls Together is basically Saroyan's swan song to fiction. Even though he would go on to live another 20 years. I think this book was written in 1963, and he dies in around 1981, 82, somewhere in that area. Even though he goes on to live another couple of decades, really he does not write a whole lot of fiction after this piece. And you can argue that he's not writing fiction here. Even here, he's starting to move into autobiography. By this time, he's a decade past his marriage. He's been away from it for a while. So I think she's with Mathau by now. He's not, moved on in any way. He still misses his family, I think. He still misses his kids. He feels embittered toward all that. And, he's looking back on his marriage, and he decides to write a novel. And he's already like 10 years away from his last great work of fiction. And within a year's time, he wrote Tracy's Tiger and Rockawagam, which is one of the great underrated books of the 20th century. Rockawagam is just outstanding. It is one of my favorite books of all time. It's more a philosophical tract than it is a novel, but it is absolutely stunning work. I just love it to death. You should, if you can get your hands on it, you should read that rather than the book I'm reviewing now, because it's a much better book if you've not read Saroyan. In fact, if you've not read Saroyan, this book I'm reviewing now is not the place to start, because it's what I'm telling you. It comes at the end of his fiction writing career, and I guess he goes on to write more short stories. Or I'm not saying this is the last fiction he ever wrote in his life, but it is the last book-length fiction I believe he ever wrote in his life, and it's the last what you could say is swan song into real fiction. Even though he was, like I said, probably late 40s when he wrote it, somewhere in that area. So anyway, the plot, like all Saroyan novels, like all Saroyan stories, is not that interesting. In fact, Saroyan almost seems to think that plot doesn't matter. The basic plot is a man who is a writer, who's just out of the army, is having trouble writing. He's living with his wife, and she's a pill. She's given him a lot of grief because of money, and she wants to see her friends, and she's lonely, and she wants to go back to New York when they're living in San Francisco. And she doesn't want to do much, and she's complaining a lot. And he's basically out of money and out of options, and he can't write. He just can't get there anymore. It used to be so easy for him. So you see the autobiography coming in here. It's basically what I just told you about his life. And so he goes and starts playing the horses. And he doesn't have a lot of money yet, but he has a lot of credit because he's played the horses a lot over his career, when he used to be riding high and have a lot of money, and he would blow lots of money on the horses. And he goes and he plays the horses, and he loses a little bit at first, but then he wins, and he wins kind of big. He wins like $6,000, which at the time, remember this book is written in 1962 in that area, 61. That was enough money to live on, he thought, for a year. And he says that in the book. We have enough money now to live on for a year. If we don't spend money stupidly, if we don't go out and buy a bunch of stuff. Of course, the first thing she does is go out and buy a bunch of stupid stuff, a bunch of clothes, so she can meet with her friends. And then they're going to go to Reno, and she wants to go to Reno with them. And you get the idea that this woman's just going to just drive him into the poorhouse. He just can't live simply with her. But he goes, he wins, and then he bets again, and he wins again. Now, usually you would think, oh, here comes the comeuppance. He's being pushed into a corner. He's gonna go out and bet everything, and then he's gonna lose everything. He's gonna have nothing. But that's not what happens in a novel. In a novel, he doesn't face that kind of adversity. The novel just kind of peters out, and I think that's one of the reasons it's one of his weaker works. But then, with Saroyan, it's never about the plot. It never is about the plot. It's about the Saroyan. It's about getting into the poetry of Saroyan. And Saroyan was a poetic writer. He was a writer who was writing poetry and passing it off as fiction. And it's in that poetry, it's in that philosophy and that these ideas that he puts into his characters that make the work worthwhile almost always. I mean, you look at the great book Rockwood Graham, which is the best thing that Saroyan ever wrote in novel form, definitely. My personal favorite is My Name is Aram, but these two books are by far his best, but they're different. Aram, it really is fiction, whereas Ragram is a philosophical tract. Anyway, this turn in the plot, where he goes to, and here's the big thing, the big hinge. After these friends are invited, and they come out to San Francisco, and they're visiting, and they're spending money, and and the friends are just kind of, shallow, Hollywood types, and one of them is a famous villain. I don't know who he was. It might have been Boris Karloff or somebody like that. But he, and his like young wife, and then there's another couple, and the other couple, the husband, while he's on his trip, has a heart attack and dies. And so they have to deal with the funeral, and they do all this stuff, and it's not very good as far as plot goes. But toward the end of the book, you start to see it all comes together. It starts to come together in what Saroyan's really trying to say about boys and girls together. And it's the reason why he uses that title. What he's saying is basically, there's a reason it's not men and women together. It's boys and girls, and that these people are in some ways, and maybe all people are emotionally stunted. That the idea that you grow up and that you find your way in the world, and you're able to understand what's going on in a big sense, it just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen to anybody, and you lose it. You lose your ability. You think you're a big guy. You think that you're on your way, but you don't really get there. And I want to read you a couple of passages, and the first one I read already in another talk, but this one I want to read it again, and I want to get to where he says some of this stuff. The burden was home again. The anxiety was back, the tenseness, the deep troubling, all the things nagged. He was failing, that's all. He was no longer tireless, that's all. He was getting along, and the gimp was in him forever now, to let him know. His carcass was fat now, his gut swollen, his neck thick. He was a bigger load than he ought to ask himself to carry, but he just couldn't get things back to form, back to the good old limits, back to resilience, ease, and speed. He was slowed down, overloaded, and wearing out. His face was puffy from eating more than he needed, and yet, if he didn't eat so much, he couldn't carry the load at all. Well, he thought, that's it. That's all. Old and fat and slow at a time when a man ought to be stepping into his best vigor. Old, fat, slow, and foolish. That's fine. And so, again, you're seeing Saroyan looking at himself and saying, the young man is no longer there. It's gone. And he talks about the gimp. The body, later on he will talk about how the body is... and he puts this in the actor's voice, and I'll get to that in a minute. You lose the ability to function as a young person, and all that optimism that he felt earlier in his career is all gone. And I think he senses well, he certainly sensed by the time he wrote it, because it was 10 years after the divorce, that this is all going to explode. All this stuff, he can't hold it. He can't hold it together. And he's declining. And that we all decline. And there's nothing that you can do about it in some ways. Except it. Accept the fact that you're not very much and you're becoming less all the time. Even if you started out as very much, you're becoming less all the time. So that's one of the themes he's working at, is that there's this trickle out of your life, and you're going further away from what matters into what is just decline, and you can't hold it. You become fat and swollen and weak. And then I want to read you this long rant. It's almost a rant what this actor says. This is the setup. The actor is, everybody's felt bad about the divorce. I mean, not the divorce, the death of the other guy. And the actor, unlike the author, the narrator, had seen the death. He'd seen the guy have his heart attack and die, and it had an effect on him. And so they're standing while the women are talking and planning their little trip to Reno. The two men, who, one of which is an old man and about and certainly coming to the end of his days, and the other is a man in deep decline, are talking. And this is what the actor says. "I feel something in my bones," the actor said. "I've been feeling jittery ever since I saw it happening." This is the heart attack. "I wish I'd missed that. I've acted having an attack dozens of times and seen great actors act it, too, but it's not that way at all. It's not art. It's not acting. It's in the eyes. The damn light shoots out of them. It's like electric flashes. But that isn't it either. I mean, it's dying. It's getting it quick, and you don't want to believe it. Do you know, he tried to brush it off even when it was happening because he was ashamed. He wanted to be alive, maybe young, and he was dying and wasn't young, and neither am I. Everybody's crazy about young Tail. Well, there's mine over there with yours. You're not old, but you're not young either, certainly not as young as your tail is, and hell, I'm so much older than mine, it's not even funny, that's all. I love it. Who doesn't? But if you saw that poor phony, he must have been a phony all his life trying to brush it off the way he tried. He must have been a phony to be ashamed because his young tail, with her fine sex all over her, was seeing him made a fool of that way. If you had seen him get his and then keep getting it, you'd feel a little older than you are even. But I'm glad you didn't see it. I only wish to God he'd dropped dead before I ever got here, because I've seen him dead, and that's not so bad, but seeing him die, seeing that enemy take him, that's another story. I didn't sleep all night. I didn't mind being alone until 5 a.m. when Alice came by and took her clothes off and wanted fun. Wanted me to get her pregnant, she said, right then. Get me pregnant, you old man, she said. What's the use of not talking plainly? And as sick as I was, drunk as she was, I wanted her. I forgot the phony dying and everything else and wanted her. Wanted to make her pregnant. Would have given anything in the world if I could, but there it is. She was young, drunk, and gorgeous, and I wanted all of it, but couldn't have any of it. I mean, the poor body can't keep up with the mind. It fails. It's still there. It's supposed to be alive. It's still supposed to have its vigor, but it doesn't. It's old, it's tired, and it's teased by the foolishness of the mind. It's teased by the eye, still looking, still wanting. I hope you don't mind my spilling all this. I'm troubled. She's not for me, that's all. I mean, I don't want to let her know I know. I don't want to let myself know even. But she's not for me. Just as Lucretia wasn't for that poor phony Leander. I know he couldn't really paint. He could flatter and get a lot of money for a phony portrait of a female monster, making her look like a fierce spirit, but he couldn't paint. Even I know he couldn't. But she's not for me. I'll be damned if I can pretend she is. I buffaloed her into thinking she is for me, or she's buffaloed herself into thinking she is, but it's not so. I don't think she's for one man at all, even the youngest, even the horniest. A man who lived for nothing else. He'd never be able to fill that hole. The more he tried, the further away he'd be from succeeding. I'll stay on, though. Why not? I'm almost as much for her as any man could be. The kids love her, need her, and so do I. But what about what she needs? She needs it too. She needs it, has a right to need it, has a right to try and see about working it out somehow. I thought money would get it all straight for me, but I've had more money than I know what to do with for more than 30 years. I need her. Not Alice, if you know what I mean. I need her, and Alice has got her all over the place. She's in good measure and the best I've ever known, but I don't need her as much as she needs him. A hell of a lot of him. More than I am now. More than I could ever be. More than I've ever been. And there was a time, not more than 20 years ago, when I was a lot of him. Almost enough. That's what's bothering me. But I'll shut up. That's all. And we'll pretend I haven't said anything. The actor's eyes brightened, and then he laughed. I'm not giving her up. If it kills me, I'm not. Let it kill me. Something he's bound to, in any case. And so you see this idea that no matter what you do, it's never going to be enough. Not for a woman like Carol, or not for fame, or not for anything. I think Saroyan was coming to grips with that in some way he failed. But he failed in a way that we all fail. He failed to keep that Saroyan-esque optimism throughout his life. He couldn't keep it. Maybe nobody can. Maybe in some ways it's best not to start out with all that buoyant optimism. Maybe it just weighs on you after a while to always have to be happy and positive. I don't know. I do know that Saroyan died a sad man. He was not loved by his children, really. He had been long abandoned by the only woman he ever really loved. And I think that's truly, truly a sad thing, because to me, he's one of my literary fathers. A lot of my literary fathers are very sad people. I mean, Raymond Carver had a sad life. He didn't die in a bad place, but he died very young, so that was sad. But he didn't. He was an unhappy man at the time. But I just think, what a great writer he was. What an honest writer throughout it all, because he could have pretended to be happy. He could have kept on pretending to be Saroyan-esque, but he didn't. He was who he was, always. And I try to do that myself. I try to be that kind of writer who's always honest and who's always trying to give the truth of myself and the way I see the world. That's a difficult thing to do. I would not, as I said earlier, recommend this book for those who are just starting out with Saroyan. It would give a wrong impression of his work overall, and I think that if you want to truly understand Saroyan, you have to start at the beginning. You start with, the Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze book, and My Name is Aram, and those books, the Bicycle Rider of I think it's Beverly Hills, and books like that, and Tracy's Tiger, up through Tracy's Tiger, really, and up through Rockwell Graham. Those books, I think, represent the bulk of his great work. And then it's the later books with the autobiographical stuff fills that in. It fills in that the information of his life. But I see that work as more I don't know. I don't think of it as his best stuff. I think he really does go into decline as a great artist somewhere after this book. But that doesn't mean that stuff is not worth reading. Saroyan is always worth reading. He's always an honest writer. He's always heads and shoulders over most people. It's just he's not the towering giant that he was at one time. So it's unfortunate that he's not studied more and appreciated more today than he is. He's an incredible writer. He was an incredible writer. He was, I don't know, I didn't know him personally. I was a boy when he died, but I would have loved to have met him. I think he was a big personality, and sometimes big personalities are just hard personalities. He may not have been a good man, I don't know. I didn't know the man. But as a writer, he was astoundingly talented. He was, in a lot of ways, everything you could want in a writer. Talented, honest, gifted in language and in thought. And he comes from a deep-rooted history and culture. And he's insanely American in every way that you can think of. And if you've not read Saroyan, please go forth and pick up the earlier works first, and then you will come to appreciate even these later works that are challenging and may not seem overly happy reading, but are nevertheless full of grace and wisdom. And thank you for listening. And please go read Saroyan, and God bless you.